The Dane and Derek Show is an uncensored, unfiltered podcast. Content warnings can be found in the episode description. Hello, everybody, and welcome to a podcast far, far away, your weekly Dane and Derek show. But this time we're doing something different because it's Star Wars month. I'm Benig-Aiello, a writer, director, and occasional Jedi. And with me, as always, is my good friend, Dane Fogdull. Happy belated May the 4th, everybody.
Happy belated May the 4th to you all. I'm Dane. I'm a writer, podcaster, musician. And, you know, I would really like to say that I'm an occasional Jedi, but I know myself well enough to know that I'd fall to the dark side. I get too emotional, you know, like just honestly. So, you know, here we are.
Yeah, I mean, that's very fair. But, you know, bouncing back and forth between light, dark, and gray, that's all part of the Jedi experience, you know, being force sensitive. That's all a part of it, you know? It really depends on your viewpoint, I guess. I think I was just rewatching the original trilogy, which we'll get into in a minute. And Obi-Wan talks a lot about light side, dark side, good versus evil. It all matters from what perspective. And I was like, wow, they really don't say which is good or bad, even though it's like heavily implied, but they kind of lose that in like later movies and media. But you know, let's not get too into it. Real quick, Dane, what is your favorite starship in Star Wars?
Okay. This is an important distinction. Are we talking about class of ship or individual ship?
Ooh, I don't know the classes very well, but I'll take either answer.
Okay, I have both. Class of ship is the classic X-Wing, which I don't have the proper name for. I'm sorry to whoever's listening who does know. But the classic X-Wing is probably my favorite individual ship. But the individual, like, unique has a name is the Ghost from Star Wars Rebels.
Ooh, good choice. For me, I'm a big fan of like freighter class ships. So like whatever that big freighter ship is at the end of Empire, that Luke and Leia are on, that one.
That frigate, the one that's got like that's kind of like spindly in a weird way. Like it's like two parts connected by like a narrow sort of bridge. Yeah, that one is cool. It's like a medical frigate or something.
Yeah, I like that one a lot. But that said, the opening to Revenge of the Sith, when Anakin and Obi-Wan are in their like starfighter ships, I think they're not Y-wings. They're something else.
They're Jedi starfighters, but they've got like they've got like the little fold opening wings. And there's something almost TIE fighter-y about them.
Yes, yeah, I truly love those ships.
It's good design.
They're just, the design and I don't know. I feel like it emulates pod racing really well in a way that you don't see too much of in the prequels, in a weird way. But we're not here to talk about the prequels. We're here to talk about the originals. And by the originals, we mean the original Star Wars, the original Empire Strikes Back, and the original Return of the Jedi, episodes 4, 5, and 6, respectively, before they were renamed episodes 4, 5, and 6. Dane, I'm curious, did you see the originals before Phantom Menace growing up?
I don't know. I cannot remember exactly. I have a really distinct memory of Phantom Menace because I was like 4 when I saw it, and the final duel like scared the crap out of me as a kid. What I did have is I didn't watch the prequels a lot as a kid because I didn't own them. I had the original trilogy on VHS, and I wore those tapes out, except for Empire. I didn't run Empire out because Empire also scared me as a kid, and also I did not like it as much as the others, because in Empire Strikes Back, the heroes lose. And as a kid, I was like, no, thank you. Now I'm all about that shit. But like back then I was like, no. So like, I want to like check in with you about this. It's almost like just gospel that the original trilogy is kind of just considered the best bit of Star Wars media out there, period. Like it's just,
yeah.
And kind of also on some level, Empire Strikes Back is also kind of considered, like, Star Wars does not get any more better than Empire Strikes Back. It's the gold standard. There's nothing greater than it, right? And by extension, the original trilogy is like untouchable, I guess. How do you feel about that?
I think the original film is untouchable. When it comes to Empire, I watched all three of them on Saturday with some people that hadn't really seen the Star Wars movies, but had played the games and seen like the sequel series and stuff. And it was really interesting seeing their reactions to the original film and Empire, and of course Return of the Jedi. And ultimately what I found, and I think like just having grown up and like finally like rewatching Empire after so long, and kind of like where we are as a society evaluating male behavior, Empire to me it doesn't hold up as well as it does, because there's some questionable things that some of the characters do to each other that I'm not sure if I approve of or am thrilled with, compared to the original film, which is it's very different. It's very different. Like the tone in Empire and besides the whole like Empire being more dark, Empire is actually a really funny movie. Like there's a lot of humor.
It is funny.
Yeah, but like it's different. It's like a more quippy kind of humor than
it's better timed. It's better timed humor.
Yeah, it's very different. And like I see how Empire sets the tone for the prequels and the sequels, which I think are more trying to emulate Empire than they are the original movie in terms of like the timing and how they're written. Granted, I'm pretty sure that like the sequels had the same writer as Empire, which is Lawrence Kasdan, who also wrote Indiana Jones and a couple of other like really great movies from that time period. And so like I kind of see those similarities, but I don't know, man. I still really love the originals. I think I have a much bigger appreciation for the original film than I ever did growing up. Like, I don't know, like as a kid, I always loved Return of the Jedi. And as like a teen and like, you know, like in college, I really liked Empire. But where I am now, I really think the original movie, like I could rewatch the original movie over and over again. The others, I have a much harder time rewatching over and over again.
Interesting. So here's what I'll say. As a kid, I loved Return of the Jedi the most. And for me, the whole Jabba sequence is peak Star Wars for me. For me, I don't know if Star Wars gets any better than the Jabba's palace sequence.
100% agree.
I will say there are the occasional scenes or things that kind of come close, but I really love that one. And there's just too much nostalgia there to like ever really top it. My feelings on the original trilogy kind of go broadly like this. There is so much magic in the original trilogy, and it is such a synthesis of pop culture, science fiction and fantasy and myth at a certain point in history, like just sort of like a keystone that in the same way that I find Lord of the Rings to be a flawed masterpiece, I find Star Wars to be the same. There are the original trilogy, at least. I'm like, this is a keystone piece of like mythos. And like that's important, and there's a lot to love in there, and there's a lot to be frustrated with in there, like what you're talking about with male figures, like looking at you, Solo, looking at you. Yeah. She said no, and you should have like you need to be like better. Looking at you, man. But like that's the one that like gets me, right?
Right.
In that sense. And actually I do have, we'll probably dig into this a bit more when we hit the prequels. I actually think the prequels are significantly worse, though. and we'll get there later. But honestly, there's, like I said, there's a lot to love. There's a lot to be frustrated with. I think Empire might be the best written one overall, as far as like anybody who's anybody, like everybody knows that George Lucas can't write dialogue to save his life, right? Like that's just not what he does, right? And something in Empire really, really works, if you ask me. And it changed cinema. It changed a lot of things. And so I think there's a lot to respect in there. And I think that there's a lot of joy to it. And there is something that I kind of understand about why it is so touchstone. And it's why kind of everybody can agree on, like, yeah, the originals are good, because like everything else is built on top of it. Right.
Yeah.
The Mandalorian can be your very favorite Star Wars thing, and there's nothing wrong with that, and Kick-Ass, and that's awesome. You know, the sequel trilogy can be your favorite thing. Your favorite thing can be the Knights of the Old Republic MMO RPG, right? Like that can be your favorite Star Wars thing. But without those three movies, it doesn't exist, period. Like, end of sentence, right? Like,
exactly.
And so I haven't watched them in, I think, about a year. I considered doing it for these episodes, but I also I was thinking I don't think I want to cram these in, because I watched them at like a really interesting moment. Because leading up to the release of episode 9, I rewatched them all in not in release order, but in narrative order, because I was just like, this will be fun. I walked away from them as a whole having had the best time, if that makes sense. Of the three trilogies that exist, as a whole, all three movies working together, and coupled, of course, with my nostalgia for growing up with them and everything, I walked away the most satisfied. I found it to be this is the most complete and whole story of all three. Though not quite as terrible as one might expect, and I still got a lot of joy out of them. The prequels I definitely walked away from with the least satisfaction, and the sequel trilogy was kind of in the middle. And so what I think works about the original trilogy is that there also isn't any legacy. There isn't anything that it's trying to fit. It is telling its story as it's going, if that makes sense. Yeah. It's not burdened by needing to be something else. It doesn't need to live up to anything beyond the movie before it, perhaps, depending on which one you're watching. And there's also a certain amount of joy in all of them. You can listen to the stories, right? They talk about the trash compactor scene being a pain in the ass. And Mark Hamill will talk about how hard Dagobah was, because he was basically alone acting off of a puppet for ages and ages. Right. But there is something very ragtag and joyous in what they're doing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, it was kind of like this culmination of all of these filmmaking techniques that were just on the cusp of being invented, that basically came into fruition for this movie, right? They used computers, they used claymation, they hand painted in lasers. Ben Burtt invented the lightsaber sound effect. Yep. And they used practical effects to simulate the lightsaber lighting effect. None of the future films do that. The lightsabers have that special sheen because of a rotating piece of metal in them. And, all the sets were built and functional and tactile. And then when you think about the fact that the original film was made for $11 million, which is $40 million today or something, that's is not a lot of movie.
Ridiculously low.
Yeah, ridiculously low for a movie of that scale. And it doesn't really show. And that's, I think, super important about these movies, is that when things are being claymation, when things are stop motion animated, but you don't really care, because the story and the characters and the sort of believability is there that a lot of modern movies, not just limited to Star Wars, don't have. And to your point about Empire, I think I think Empire really sets the tone for modern blockbusters. Like if you look at modern blockbusters and their kind of quippiness, their wittiness, the screenwriting, and you look at Empire, they're like pretty hand in hand, pretty similar, I think. And that's a really interesting like cultural shift in filmmaking, you know, that like is like more loosely affecting everything. Like probably Fast and Furious 9 probably has more in common with Empire Strikes Back than we realize, you know?
Oh yeah, certainly. And
that's insane. It's insane that that's the kind of impact it has on people. And there's also just a level of just like, you know, like in a lot of ways, like Star Wars was like the Lord of the Rings of its time, you know? It was sort of the peak performance of this sort of genre of space opera that had been done for years, but it kind of brought it into this new level, like you were saying, this new level of pop culture and magic.
Yeah. And I think it like I said, like it was that culmination. You're totally right. And its impact is still being felt. And it will be for a long time and probably quietly on some level forever, right? Like, you know, we're still feeling the effects of Hercules, like the myth, you know, like
in 1,000 years, people will talk about the old world with their spaceships and Star Wars, you know, like something wild like that. It'll be a real galaxy quest where people will think that these are actual historical documents. of a long documented space war that took place here.
I think there's just it's monumental. Like the original trilogy is monumental and it holds up is the other thing, right? Like as any piece of media ages, right, there are going to be things that we no longer find acceptable, right? And then you have to kind of like cross the bridge and decide whether or not we throw out media, right? Like, do we throw out artwork because it, because basically it doesn't hold to our standards anymore, or do we decide that we acknowledge this, learn from it, and essentially like take what value there is, you know? And I think if you're willing to do that, which, you know, no judgment to anybody who's not, anybody who like watches it and is like, I just can't, I respect that.
Right.
I think that there's a lot to learn from the original trilogy. I think there's a lot to enjoy. And you know, like I feel like I'm struggling here because it's just like, well, like, what are you supposed to say about the original trilogy of Star Wars at this point? Like, right. Like on some level, it's all been like said and done. And we're not really like a history show. So like, we're not going into like all the facts and details. We haven't done the research for that. Cause there's just so many of them. So, you know what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to shift the conversation away from like discussing like its impact and its like value over to can we just gush for a second? Like, yeah, like
I've been wanting to ask you this since you mentioned it. How many times did you rewind the VHS tape just to watch Luke jump off the diving board and do that flip and catch his lightsaber?
Well, okay, not as often as you'd think, because what I'd actually do is I'd just rewind the whole movie and watch it again.
Oh, nice.
Just to watch the get back to the one scene. I guess I just wasn't clever enough as a kid to think, oh yeah, I could just rewind this bit and like do it again. Like some part of my brain was like, no, we got to finish and we'll just come back around and start over the whole damn thing. But like, that scene as a kid was just like the most adventurous and it was so exciting. And like, it felt like Luke was finally a Jedi, like for real. Like it really did. It was always so exciting and heroic. And it really catches like that like swashbuckly thing, that Star Wars has that I actually think is most lost in the prequel trilogy is like that it's that also there's supposed to be something kind of pirate movie like about them, and like there's so much joy in that scene because it's also just purely heroic and somehow separate from the rest of the films. Like most of the movies are about like we're facing the Empire and we're struggling with that, and they just spend like an hour dealing with some weird desert pirate gangster, like, and it's like
yeah, it's like the first 40 minutes of the movie are dedicated to rescuing Han from a pirate, a space pirate worm gangster.
Yeah, and I'm like, this, and like watching it, you're like, this doesn't matter at all, like at all, you know, like so sometimes in those in Star Wars films, like so much can happen off screen, right? Like because it could be in the title crawl, you know what I mean? Like
yeah.
Like how they get to from the parade medal awarding scene at the end of A New Hope to the fucking Hoth, like that's just in a blurb, that's just in a fucking sentence, right? Like it was both covered in Legends and in like the modern comics, like this huge arc and sets of adventures between then and then, and I'm thinking about it, I'm like, wow, they just glossed over like all kinds of potential stuff. They could have glossed over Jabba's palace, but they didn't. And I fucking love that they didn't. That's so fun. Yeah. It's so much fun. But like, is that your scene from the original trilogy too? Or is there like a different one?
That is my scene from the original trilogy. 'Cause it's just, it's like you said, it's everything that you hope Luke can become and everything that you hope just Star Wars is. And you know that, and I think the next scene that I like is the when they're on the Death Star in the first film, when they're just kind of like sneaking around, putting on helmets, you know, using grappling hooks, and when Obi-Wan is just like going around like turning things off, like there's some it's just so cleverly like constructed.
Mm-hmm.
And I just must say like yes, like Han shooting first is like super cool and whatever, and it really changes his character when, you know, it gets edited out. But my favorite scene in that bar is truly like, it's truly when Obi-Wan, you know, protects Luke and whips out a lightsaber for the second time or third time in a movie. Because I think the lightsabers only come out like, that's the thing, right? Like in the original trilogy, the lightsabers don't really come out that often.
No, it's really special when they do. It's really special when they do. Like in the original film, Luke draws his father's lightsaber in Obi-Wan's hut, does a little bit of training on the Falcon. Obi-Wan cuts off that guy's arm in the bar. And then there's the duel.
Yeah.
And I think that's it. And then hold on, I'm just trying to think about it. Like in Empire, he cuts off the Wampa's arm on Hoth.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
There's the trial in the cave. And then I think there's the
AT-AT battle.
The AT-AT battle. Yep. Which is really brief, which is and Han uses it.
Yes, Han uses it. And then Cloud City.
Which, to be fair, that is a much longer scene and much more drawn out and extensive.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That scene is really great.
Yes. The first time Luke versus Vader is very good. And then in Return of the Jedi, you know, Luke, he uses it pretty extensively in that first Jabba scene. He uses it fairly frequently on Endor. Yeah.
He never uses a blaster.
No, not in the whole film.
Yeah,
which is like super, super cool.
Yeah, because you know, the first film he basically only uses the blaster. The second film, he's going back and forth. You know, He enters Cloud City using a blaster, but fights his way out with a lightsaber, and eventually loses everything.
Yes,
which is like super cool.
Yeah,
and narratively, you know, it's not cool that he lost his hand and all that stuff, but
narratively, it's cool. But
narratively, yeah.
And then in the prequels, they're all the fucking time.
Yeah, everywhere. Literally everywhere. Everyone's got a lightsaber.
And on the one hand, like, I'm kind of like, I have like mixed feelings about that, because on the one hand, it's like, okay, well, you've kind of like removed like the mysticism around them. But on the other hand, it does show a different era, and that kind of makes sense. And I actually think that the sequel trilogy does a really good job on the frequency of lightsaber use.
Agreed.
On returning them to feeling very like, ooh, the lightsaber's here, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, yeah, I agree with that. And I think that like we've talked a lot about like, when do you pull out the lightsaber? You know, we use that term to, you know, to talk about like when we're like playing like D&D games or writing movies, like we use that term to kind of describe like, you know, because the lightsaber is effectively an end all be all weapon. And when do you pull that out and when do you not? And that's such a great like narrative thing.
Right, because it's also a signal, right? Like in the original trilogy, something that's super cool is that when the lightsaber comes out, and I'm meaning this more when like the duels happen more than anything, is like when you pull out the lightsaber, it means that the fight is about to matter, if that makes sense. It's like the same thing as when in a Western you pause and you don't just let the people like draw their guns super fast and you start drawing it out. You start putting a lot more narrative weight on this particular conflict.
Everything in the original trilogy, almost every conflict truly matters. And that's something that I think in the prequels and sequels, they kind of lose that because it's a lot of world-ending stakes, whereas they kind of build to those world-ending stakes. And even then, even if they are world-ending stakes, it's more what we care more about is the personal stakes.
Yeah, like I said, it's the one I came away most satisfied from when watching all three very close together. I'm trying to like consider any, but we're kind of like running on time. But I want to like shout out just some wonderful scenes that always like, always meant the world to me. Luke throwing the lightsaber away, always special, always goddamn special. The whole battle on Hoth, very cool, very exciting to see that first loss. It's actually like it super sets up the tone of the rest of the film. I thought that was really, really cool. Twin sons, oh my god, twin sons. I think we've talked about that so many times in the past. I just didn't even think to bring it up. But the twin sons in the very first.
What was that line? You know, always looking towards the horizon that Yoda says to him.
Yeah.
That's all we got to talk about the original trilogy this week, folks. But don't worry, every week we're going to be talking about something Star Wars related. Next week will be the prequels. And you can be sure to follow the show at Dane and Derek. That's Dane with an and then an N and then Derek, like our names, conveniently, pretty much everywhere. And you can also follow me at Benig-Aiello. And feel free to tweet at us. You know, send us some questions. We'd love to hear feedback and hear what you all have to say about the Star of Wars. Dane, where can we find you and your work?
You can find me on Twitter at Dane_Fogdoll, and you can listen to my show Diceology, which is spelled like the science of dice, on iTunes, Stitcher, or Spotify.
May the Force be with you all, and we'll see you next week.
Catch you later.